This tutorial is brought to you by Hey, what's up guys? My name is Josh Inobakare and welcome to Olufemi Tutorials. Hey, what's up guys? We're talking about shutter speeds. If you remember, there are three pillars of exposure: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. These three pillars of exposure determine the brightness and the darkness of your footage. You want to try to get perfect exposure because you don't want your footage to be too bright or too dark. Shutter speed, the first pillar of exposure, is referring to the amount of time that your camera's sensor is going to be exposed to light. You can have either a fast shutter speed or a slow shutter speed. A fast shutter speed is letting in less light. A slow shutter speed is going to let in more light. Shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second. An example of a fast shutter speed would be, say, something like 1,000th of a second. 1,000th of a second is letting in very little light because it's a very fast shutter speed. An example of a slow shutter speed would be something like maybe 1/50th of a second. While how fast and how slow your shutter speed can determine how dark or how bright your footage is, it also has a side effect. That side effect is motion blur. The faster your shutter speed is, the less motion blur you're gonna have. The slower your shutter speed is, the more motion blur you're gonna have. If you've seen Saving Private Ryan, there's this really cool effect that you see a lot during the action scenes. And what the effect is it's a low motion blur effect. Whenever you watch sports on TV, they love to film with really high shutter speeds because they don't like any motion blur. Another thing is music videos. If you watch a lot of really cool like music videos with a lot of like dancing, like say Chris Brown music video, they're gonna use high shutter speed to cut that motion blur. And what it gives is this really cool surreal effect where you can literally see every single frame. There's no blur. So for Saving Private Ryan, I believe they used a shutter speed just over 1/100th of a second. You may wonder, what is the ideal amount of motion blur? That's a good question. It's been determined that the ideal amount of motion blur is 1/double the frame rate. You may wonder, what is frame rate? We're going to talk about that in another video, but all you need to know now is that the ideal frame rate in order to give you that cinematic look is 24 frames per second, or 23.976 frames per second to be exact. So if you do the math, 1/double the frame rate is 1/50th of a second shutter speed. 1/50th of a second shutter speed while you're using 24 frames per second is going to give you neither too much motion blur or too little motion blur. Now again, motion blur is there's not necessarily an ideal amount of motion blur. You may want there to be less motion blur than normal. Say you're shooting a music video or a sports match, or you're shooting the Saving Private Ryan. You want that Saving Private Ryan look where you have, a lot of action going on and you love that cool effect. Or maybe you're shooting a scene where the person's drunk and you're trying to like almost give you the audience this disoriented look where there's so much motion blur, the whole world is in a spin. You may want less than the ideal amount of motion blur. But if you want the typical amount of motion blur that you'd want, most of the time, you're gonna want to stay around 1/50th of a second. All right, guys, so stay tuned. Shutter speed is only the first pillar of exposure. We still have aperture and ISO to cover. Click this next video to learn about aperture.